what do you think are the must do's when it comes to like going from somebody who thinks they don't have a great quote unquote mindset to a mindset that could really help them perform and succeed in life?
Yeah, so here I think when we hear mindset, we often think of like the buzzwords like growth mindset, coming through in the clutch, like how you see stress, all those things. And those matter. Those are good concepts. But to me, I think it comes down to like how are you telling your own story? Because like how you're telling your story shapes kind of your mindset and like how your brain is going to see the future. I think if we look at the current psychology and neuroscience, it's that our brain is predictive, and the predictions it takes are based on past experience and then the current information coming in. Well, when it comes to past experience, like what is that but our mindset and how we're telling our story to face the challenge before us? And the good thing about that is that it's highly manipulatable because our memory is highly manipulatable, meaning like how we internalize the thing shapes how we're going to then see the challenge in the future. So when it comes to mindset, I think the biggest things are that people think like, oh, I've got to like think in this certain way, or I've got to like see stress in this certain way. But to me, I think it's more kind of looking back and saying, how are you telling the story about the evidence that you need to face whatever it is? So if you're, writing, if you're like me and in writing a book, it's like, how are you telling your story about like your experience leading up to this thing? If you're stepping into the big game, how are you telling yourself the story about how you've handled pressure, how you've handled losses, how you've bounced back in the past? Because that's going to shape how you see it now. So it's a little bit more nebulous than I think mindset, but like it's really just how are we telling our stories that help us in a way to take on what's before us.
And how do you help people do that when, because I think sometimes what people struggle with is the evidence like isn't really there for them. And you hear a lot about like affirmations and changing the way you talk to yourself, which I think can have merit. But I think what happens is people are like, all right, I'm gonna run a faster mile, and yet you haven't run a faster mile in like 5 years. Or I'm gonna make more money this year and I'm confident that I can do it, but yet like you haven't been able to make more money even though you've tried hard for 5 years. So like I know you're really into like science and not pseudoscience. So how can somebody like effectively, based on what you've learned, like reframe the way they think about their life in a way that will actually, in a way that when they tell themselves these things, they won't think that they're lying to themselves?
Well, I think that's the key here is we can't BS ourselves. We can a little bit, but we can't. Like if we try and fake it, like our brains is eventually going to be like, hey, I know you really think you can run this marathon, but you haven't trained a step. Like there's no substance behind it. So what I like to look at is we've got to create that substance and evidence. And the thing is, when people hear evidence, they think that means I have to be able to say I've done the thing before, and that's not what it is. Evidence is about giving yourself enough, clues that say, hey, I got a shot. I can step into the arena. Like, if you can do that, then you're in a good spot. So what do I look for is I think often when we say I want to run a faster mile, I want to do, I want to sell more whatever it is, I want to get more followers on social media or downloads on podcasts, is we often start with like this big end goal instead of starting with like, okay, what are the key things that allow me to give just a little bit of evidence that I can take right now that show me that like this path is possible. Because all you're trying to do to prove to your brain is say like there is hope, this path is possible, we can continue down this path. So instead of looking at that kind of ceiling, I like to bring it back to the floor of like what can I do right now? Can I go out and like walk jog a mile? Great. Like start there. When it comes to like producing a podcast, can I consistently put something out that is like pretty good? Great. start there. Because like when we start at the we'll call it the simplest step, then that allows us to start accumulating that evidence so that we can start crafting that story of like, you know what, I didn't think I could do this, but like I've come a little bit, so like let's keep pressing forward. It's no different than if you're starting a marathon, you don't think, okay, I've got 26.2 miles to go. If you do, you're screwed. What you do is you just kind of do this negotiation, right? You're like, okay, get to the first 5K, then we'll be all right. Get to the next aid station, right? Then we'll check in and see. And you just kind of like bridge that gap along the way.
Yeah, and I've often wondered why like these simple steps actually matter so much because they do. Like you're so right. Like you need to achieve small wins in order to like get to the bigger win. And you hear so much about like if you're somebody who wants to get more movement and just start by just putting your shoes on and then walking outside and just committing to like walking for however long. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Like, do you think that a couple things are happening here? Like, do you think that it's one, you're building confidence because you're like, all right, I'm finally doing the thing that I've been putting off for so long. And then two, I mean, there is some like, positive neurochemical thing that goes on when you move your body. Therefore, it motivates you to want to do that task more. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, you're spot on. So I think too often we think we need to be motivated to get going, and instead we need to get going to get motivated. Because what happens there is like you start the thing, and again, think of it this way: your brain is predictive; it wants evidence. If it sees you acting in a way, it says, "Oh, like I guess we're a runner. I guess we're going for a run. I guess we're working on this project." Like it starts to see that evidence, and that gives it like, okay, we can keep going on this thing, and it accumulates, and that's where that confidence goes. And then there is like a biological neuroscience mechanism in there as well, where like those small wins are just reinforcement. They're essentially you saying like, I think I can do this, and then you get a little further and your brain goes like, good job, like you actually did it, you're on the progress. And then your brain never settles. Like it's always like, what's the next step? So you give it the next step, and then it's like, okay, can we do this next step? Okay, great. Like we're on our way to get that next step. And to me, it all comes down to I think if I could simplify it, it's like you got to give yourself hope, right? Because if we have hope that we can accomplish a goal, then we get this reinforcement like mechanism and motivation. If we don't have hope and it feels like it's hopeless, what do? We default to why try mode. We just say, "Eh, I'm not gonna accomplish my goal." And you see this again. My background's track and running, but this is like running 101, right? You see someone in the thick of the race, like getting ready to run their best performance and maybe even win the race, and then for whatever reason, like they drift off that leader a little bit, and they go from running really well, and if they just maintained, they wouldn't win the race, but they still have a spectacular race. But what happens is they drift off that leader, and it goes from like, oh, I thought I was going to win, to now it's hopeless. And they go from running pretty fast to it's like jog city, like they're going backwards, right? And it's like from 100 to catastrophe. And what happens is our brain goes like, oh, your hope is gone, like hopeless, we're shutting down. We do the same thing in other aspects of our life. And that's why these small wins or small goals are really important, because instead of going from like, oh gosh, I can't, win the thing or get on the bestseller list, there's still small steps in there that like give your brain that reaffirmation that say, okay, there's still hope here. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I was thinking about like our interview before we recorded, and I was like, all right, how do I tie in like running and your expertise to like life? And the fact of the matter is, it's like the margin for error in life sometimes is so small. Like you're somebody who knows you have a problem with like substances. You get stressed and you veer off of the way you see your life. You go down this dangerous path, and that could lead to some really horrible circumstances. Right? There's other examples that I could use. My point is, like, how can people like use the techniques you teach these runners to really pay attention to how they're they're staying focused on the task at hand that can help the average person like not slip when they're on their own transformation journey?
Performance is performance. If there's anything I've learned, and I'm not even talking athletic performance, I'm talking life, right? Because what happens is, well, I might be talking like, hey, when you're running a race, you got to stay engaged, because if you don't stay engaged, you're going to go towards distraction, and then your brain's going to catastrophize, and you're going to think like, oh gosh, this hurts, this sucks, hit the eject button, take the easy way out. Your brain goes through the same freaking process. If we're looking at, you're really stressed, you struggled with substance abuse, and that drink or substance is like staring you in the face, that is your brain saying, hey, like, this is the better option over here. Not working on this thing, not staying clean, not doing, staying focused on your life and your engagement. This option over here, take it, it's tempting. It's the same psychological aspect. Our brain's going through the same inner battle. So the tactics and tools, well, we might say, hey, they're specific to this. No, it's general in terms of like, they help us deal with the battles that we face. So in those moments, instead of thinking as a race, it's like, how do you handle those moments where you're super stressed? Which, again, psychology tells us this: when we're stressed, when we're uncertain, or when we're fatigued, it's just like when we're super hungry, and we can either reach for the easy candy there, or we could cook ourselves a good hearty meal that sustains us. The easy candy is more tempting, and the hungrier we are, the more we're gonna like be driven towards just getting the candy and forget about the good hearty meal. It's the same with other things. Like, the more stressed we are, the more uncertain we are, the higher our threat of our kind of, if we feel under threat of our sense of self or our self-esteem or our ego is under threat, the more we reach for that bag of candy, whether that's quitting a race or taking the substance. So what we have to do is we have to say, okay, what are the tools and tactics when the pressure is on, when the stress is high, to be able to manage that situation? And there's a ton, but like, it's things that we just talked about. It's break it down, right? Next logical step, don't get overwhelmed. What is matters in this moment? How can I make a step towards doing the quote unquote right thing? It's reminding you and getting clear on who you are. And running, we'd say, remind yourself why you signed up for this race. Like, what was the purpose and the meaning behind it? In life, when you're in those moments, it's like, you better have a reminder of like, okay, who am I trying to be? What matters to me? And then other things like support, right? Is one of the best things, is like our sense of connection and belonging. If we're part of a team or a group that trained for this race, when you're in the thick of it, what do? You remind yourself, I'm not alone. I'm on this journey with others. And it's the same when we're looking at substance abuse or other things. It's not, it might feel like I'm stressed and it's me versus the world, but I'm not. I'm not alone. I have support. I can call up friends. I can go see family. Like, there is a community around me to help me get through this, because like, the neuroscience and psychology tells us that we were literally kind of evolved to share the load and to share our emotional regulation. So in our deepest, darkest places, we've got to be able to reach out and support and do that.
Yeah, and I think part of it is trying something or pursuing something isn't celebrated unless you win. How can people get better with their relationship to failure and success, so that they're not so attached to those things and they can continue to persevere even when things don't go their way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the Super Bowl of sports illustrates this beautifully, because it's right in front of us. And in sports, you often see it, and in other aspects of life, is one of the biggest contributors to fear of failure developing is like experiencing that in some sort of public stage, right? Because like, it almost feels like you get humiliated, right? It's just like, oh my gosh, everyone saw me perform the worst that I've ever done. This is just devastating. And what happens is going back to your story, if it feels devastating, your brain internalizes it as like, that freaking sucked. Like, next time we're in that position, like, protect, avoid, shut down, play dead, essentially, so that we don't have to deal with it. So, what do we look at when it comes to helping us deal with that better? Because I think more than ever, we're going to experience failure, and it's often more on a public stage because of just social media, the way everything's connected. There's a couple of key things that psychology tells us. Is one is diversifying your sense of self or your sources of meaning. If that football game is the only thing in your life, that failure is going to hit longer and linger longer. Now, we're not saying don't make it important. Obviously, you care, it's important, it's vital. But at the same time, you have to have some other aspects of you, meaning like you're a husband or a wife or a father, or you have other interests and hobbies outside of that, because like that essentially buffers that stress, because your brain gets to go like, yeah, it really freaking sucked to lose this game or fail at this project or not get this job, but I get to go home to my family and support system, or I'm gonna, you know what, I'm gonna be able to go play golf on the weekend to take my mind off this, or do something else that I enjoy that kind of gives me that sense of meaning and accomplishment as well. So it's first diversifying your sources of meaning, and then second, I think, is like, you've got to have a way to deal with the thing because failure is going to suck no matter what. And what the science tells us is the longer we linger in that state, the longer it ingrains in this kind of like negativity avoidance. So having some sort of system or setup where it's like, yeah, this sucks, I can't escape it, but I'm going to do stuff to get me out of protect and defend mode and back to somewhat normal. And this is where the biggest thing you can do, the best thing you can do, is like socialize and hang out with people, because there's a neurochemical effect where when we hang out with others or socialize, we get a release of oxytocin. Oxytocin is kind of a bonding hormone. And what it does is it decreases, or it sends the message to decrease the stress hormones. So we've got all these stress hormones going crazy because we lost. Like hanging out, going for a meal, shooting the shit, like having a beer with others is probably the best thing you can do. Other things you can do as well is like set up a time and a period to process. So, for example, I talked to some emergency room physicians who, their life is chaotic sometimes, right? And sometimes in a bad way. Like, you perform the surgery or whatever, do the thing, and you lose someone. And then you have to go home after your shift is over and like be relatively normal at home for your wife and kids or family. In what so many of them told me is, they said, like, from the time I leave the hospital to my commute home, that is where I'm going over things, processing, and sometimes even writing things down on like, okay, how am I going to deal with this? And then my signal is, once I open that garage door or step into the apartment, that's my signal of like, okay, I processed what I can right now. I've got it written down or whatever in my phone, in the car. Now I'm gonna put on this other hat and like transition. And I think we often need these transition moments. And I think this is why often in sports you see athletes, once they leave, like, one of the things they do is like, especially if they're married and have kids, is they say, okay, like, it's kid and family time, because they need something to get them out of like this compete, I just lost, this sucked time, and like that's what does it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to be said for having different buckets of life you focus on. Because, I mean, let's be real. No one's firing on all cylinders, right? There's always, like, I'm sure during your book launch, like, I'm sure your family life, I mean, not suffered, but you weren't able to allocate as much time as before because you're like, all right, I got this book. I worked so hard on it, I got to get it pushed out. So that kind of suffers a little bit. Then the book, launch is done, then you come back to it, maybe your fitness. And that's just the way I think life is sometimes. I do think that people really have a hard time when they've almost crafted um, an entire identity around how much they've failed, and they end up falling into the victim mindset, and they become paralyzed by fear because of that. Like, how can somebody, like, how would you take like a runner who has failed over and over and over and over and over again, like how would you help them like improve their mindset if they're so convinced that everything they've done recently is wrong?
Yeah, it's tough because again, that if it's how we tell our stories impact how we see the world. So if you start to think you're a failure, you're gonna see the world through that lens and then start acting in that way. And there's actually some fascinating research that shows that you know if we start watching like and consuming too much news that tells us the world is threatening and dangerous, we start to see and act like the world is threatening and dangerous, even if like all the statistics tell us like, hey, our neighborhood is pretty chill, like we're okay, you know. So it's the same thing with failure, and I think there is what we have to do is we have to say, okay, how are we going to get you to like change your story and give you some evidence and insight that you're okay and you're all right, and that like this failure isn't self-defining and you're still pretty dang good. Because what often happens is like we lose perspective. So a couple things here is, first I would look at, okay, how do we, going back to what we said at the beginning, how do we get some small wins? So if I was a runner, I would say, hey, let's stop competing at these like national level competitions. Let's just go compete at the, city 5K or whatever it is. Or let's enter our neighborhood 5K run, right? Because we want to lower the bar so that it's like, hey, we can get some quote unquote wins where it's like, hey, I accomplished something. Like we had some sort of success to build ourselves up as well. The other thing that I think is really important here is like perspective, because often what happens is when we start seeing ourselves through a failure, it's not that we've actually failed or done that bad, it's that our comparison point is just heavily freaking skewed. And I see this all the time with athletes, right? Athletes will say like, I'm on a bad streak, I'm performing so poorly, and I'll step back and I'll be like, yo, you know 5 years ago, if I told you you were at this level, would you have been happy? And mostly they'd be like, yeah, I've come a long way, right? But they get so locked up into looking around each other at like everybody else is doing phenomenal and there's always another place to go. So getting that perspective. And sometimes that's just like zooming out and looking at, hey, how would you of 10 years ago feel about where you are now? What if I told you you accomplished what you have now? What if we compare you not to the top of the top, but like the average person? So for instance, in book selling, right? If I was to compare myself to Atomic Habits, I'd always be disappointed. Always. But if I let James Clear go and I look at like, hey, how many books does the average nonfiction sell? It's surprisingly freaking small. It's like, not a high number. I forget exactly, but it's like in the couple hundred to few thousand, right? So in the grand scheme of things, you look back and you say, okay, you know what? Like, regardless of how this goes, like in the grand scheme of things, I'm batting pretty good. And the same with podcasts, right? We compare ourselves to, some of the big time Andrew Huberman. We might think we suck. We compare ourselves to, the average podcast or even a really good podcast. You're probably in the top 95% in downloads. And in that perspective, it might seem cheap, but what it does is it reminds you that like the story I'm telling myself about failing often is just that devil on my shoulder convincing me to try and quit or like not try or what have you, when reality is like, I might not be the best in the world, but I'm pretty freaking good. So like shifting that perspective in that comparison point, and I think that comes along with as well as like redefining what success and failure means to you. And if you're heavily focused on these outcome metrics, you've got to look at it and not, I'm not saying let go completely of the outcome metrics, But go back to, well, why did I start this thing in the first place? Why did I start running? Why did I start writing? Why did I start my entrepreneurial journey? Often it wasn't, hey, I'm going to start this to become a millionaire or what have you. Often it was like, hey, this is something I enjoy, that like sparked my interest, that I'm really curious about. And that passion there is something we forget as we get stuck on chasing the accolades. And often what we have to do is like to reframe that failure is get back to like, hey, why did we start in the first place? And it wasn't, to get the success or whatever have you.
I think a lot of people struggle with failure too because they wonder if they are living up to their fullest potential. Are they maximizing things in their life? And they don't want to get to that place later on in their life like, oh, I wish I would have tried more. I wish I would have pursued excellence more, whatever the case may be. We've spent a good amount of time talking about mindset and how to reframe certain mindset things and how you perceive life and the world to help you get ahead. What other things do you think hold people back from actually reaching their highest potential in life?
I think a lot of them are a couple things. Is first, I think we talked about mindset a lot. Second, I think it's that comparison piece that really drives us nuts. And I think the other things are that we don't really, how would I phrase this? We don't really look at like, we chase the outcome, we chase the excellence, right? We say, I want to be excellent at this thing. And often we get really good at doing the work behind it to give ourselves a shot. But because we've done so much work and put ourselves like so much invested into it, it often pushes us to that like fear or that fear of failure mindset that we've talked about. And I think one of the antidotes we haven't talked about is like building what I just call like a robust sense of self, or like building the base of the pyramid of like your psychological like ingredients that allow you to take these risks. Because often what happens is we have this idea that like I'm going to perform best when my back is against the wall and like I've gone all in and all this other stuff. And the reality is that if you look at our stress response in the research, is that, you know, when it's like our back is against the wall, we default towards not how do I perform best, but how do I survive this situation? Right? It's the lion in the savannah. It's like I'm not thinking how do I kill this lion? It's like how the hell do I get out of this alive? Like that's our stress response. So instead, what I mean by building up your psychological robustness is saying like, hey, instead of back against the wall, how do I, feel like I belong? How do I have some direction in life? How do I feel some sort of significance? How do I make my life story add up, and feel connected to others? And if we just create that robust sense of self, often what happens is that frees us up to perform to our potential. And what does it, where people get in their own way is they're really good at the hard work and maybe the grinding, but in that they've neglected like building them that base up, which is once you get to the point where it's like, hey, I'm going to take that risk. If you don't have that foundation, then it does really feel like do or die. If you have that foundation, then it feels like, all right, like I can take the risk to explore my potential, because like even if I fall a little bit short or come up against a wall and my potential isn't quite as good as I thought it was supposed to be, I am still okay. Like it is not a disintegration of Steve the person because he didn't run as fast as he hoped he could. And I think that's kind of it.
Yeah, and I think what also happens is when people are on this path of transformation or trying to go from a place where they're not fulfilled to maximizing potential, is they start to stack these small wins, they start to do the right thing, but then they become impatient, and I think everyone in some way, loves a little instant gratification, right? And so I know these small wins can provide that, but I think over time it becomes harder to reach that same level of gratification unless you start to achieve bigger things. So, how can people get better at being patient when they're on this uncertain path to success or to excellence?
That's a great point. And I think what it is a couple things is that if we look at what makes us impatient, it's when we are playing the external game, when we're saying, hey, I need to achieve X, Y, and Z. Not I want to, but I need to or have to. That makes us impatient, and it pushes us towards like getting the short term results, like focusing on here and now. How do I try and get this thing right now? And what we know when we study excellence from sports to business to life is what is it? It's generally the people who stay around long enough, doing the thing long enough to become masters of the thing succeed over the long haul, right? It's Warren Buffett literally staying in the game for decades, right? Instead of like chasing the like stock that will give him this reward right now. And I think what we have to do is we have to kind of redefine what it means to be successful so that we see this long-term thing. We need to like have that kind of that robustness of ourself so that like we can weather the storm on these short-term gains or losses and not get impatient. And then as I said earlier is we have to have the ability to like zoom out. And zoom out means perspective, but it also means I think to me is what does society kind of hold up? We often hold up and show the success stories that are quick, or we frame them as they're quick, right? The you made the 30 under 30 lists because you were a mega millionaire at this point and blah blah blah. We often don't talk about the stories that were years or decades in the making. And I think we need to look at role models that give us more of a zoomed out perspective that says like, hey, yeah, I got it, but we're going to be okay. And the last thing that I'd say is I think you can tie this all together by looking at youth sports. Because if you look at youth sports, what happens is parents often think, oh my God, it's the person who starts early, it's the Tiger Woods of the world. I have to copy and mimic that. So we go all in early. And sure, there are some success stories like Tiger Woods and others. But what overall the research shows us is those that end up making it to the top of their professional leagues in soccer and baseball and football and what have you, generally they practice less in terms of they specialize less when they were young. They played more instead of having more coaching, specific coaching hours. They essentially diversified and dabbled in different sports to kind of like explore and get that intrinsic motivation until they got somewhere towards high school where they start to specialize. So in the grand scheme of things, they specialize a little later and their peak is much longer. And I think the same is true in life, where we say, hey, if we narrow too quickly, whether that's our path on our pursuit or identity, if we narrow too quickly, we cut off the potential paths where we have no idea where we're going to end up. Because I would challenge the listeners to think back of how they're at this path in their job and their pursuit they are right now. Chances are that 15-year-old Steve or Doug or whoever, 18-year-old Steve or Doug or whoever, or 25-year-old Steve or Doug or whoever could not predict where you are right now. And we like to think that we can. But the way that we've achieved success is often put ourselves in position, dabble in a lot of interesting things, follow down the pursuits when that interest turns into passion, and take it where it goes. And there's actually research on this I came across the other day. I didn't make it in the book because I came across it too late. But when they looked at successful business owners and entrepreneurs, and they asked them, like, how much did serendipity play into your success of where you are right now? Meaning like just kind of chance and luck and stumbling into where you are. It was something like, I forget the exact stat, but it was something like 65 to 70% said a high level of it, which to me means like what we have to do is, it's impossible to predict the future, but we can improve our luck by like giving ourselves more potential paths to go down and have like the good hard work ethic and robust sense of self behind us, so that when those opportunities show up or present ourselves, we can take it, versus we're so narrowly focused on like, I'm Steve and I want to be the greatest athlete in the world, that we don't realize like, hey, like I get it, you might be pretty good at this, but like your calling, your thing, your opportunity is over in this other field, and you don't even see it because like you're just blinders on, focused straight ahead.
We've spent so much time talking about how to like dig yourself out of the mud and like get to a place of like equanimity, get to a place of like where you're kind of even, so you can pursue what it is you're trying to pursue. Coming out on the other side of that, like what tips do you have for people to be able to fully maximize their potential in life, other than like mindset, which we've already talked about in depth? Like if somebody's looking to perform at their absolute best, what needs to happen?
Yeah, I think a couple of different things is, first, I think it's how you set your life up. So how you set your environment and life up. So we hear a lot about, routines and things like this. And I think that's, great. It's covered elsewhere. But what it is like, to me, it's like, how do you make your priorities or the main things, so that you can be consistent at it? Because as we talked about it before, if you want to reach your potential, it's essentially this: consistently good enough for a long period of time. There was a great quote from Frank Shorter, who was the 1972 American who won the Olympics in the marathon. And he was a legend in the sport. And someone asked him, Frank, like, what advice would you give to some potential athlete to like reach your level? And he essentially said, do this: 2 hard workouts, a long run, as much running you can handle, and do that for not just months on end, but years on end. And in a couple years, you're gonna be really freaking good. And his point was, the problem is most people will try that for a while and say, oh, okay. And he actually said this in an interview. He said, people would show up to train with me and they'd train with me for like a month, and then I'd never see them again. And I think it's the same in life: is how do we set up our life so that in the things that we care about, we show up consistently? And that's not just work, but it's home, it's everything around us. And there's some ebb and flow. Sometimes, as you said, like with a book launch, my family life is going to suffer a little bit. But guess what? Once we're through this book launch, like I've blocked out time where it's like, no, like no work stuff. Like it's just family, because I need to rebalance this equation. So having that consistency. I think the other thing that really matters is, if you want to reach your potential, is how do you set up your environment to afford you to do that? Meaning, what we know is that our environment signals action. It tells us who we should be and what we should be doing. In the book, I outline all sorts of fascinating research, but in the workspace, for instance, it shows that like if we work at a desk that feels like our own, even if it's a cubicle, right? If we make it feel our own, meaning there's pictures of our family, there's our favorite quotes, there's things that, focus on us, then we are going to be more productive and burn out less, even if the work is, the same amount of time or effort going into it. Why? Because it signals like, hey, like it's a safe, secure place here. You can perform up to your potential. It's no different than, I don't know, playing at home versus playing out away. When you play at home, you got the fans behind you. You can keep going, right? So having your environment invite the person you want to be, the work you want to do. And then I think the last thing that is so overlooked, and we kind of talk about it a little bit, but so overlooked, is the people around you. You're not going to reach your potential by yourself. It's not. Like the idea that we need to, go into a cave and, write our masterpiece or, have our breakthrough, it's very rare. What happens is the people you surround yourself with influence and make you. And there's all sorts of research that shows us two things: is A, our motivation is contagious. So we talked a lot about mindsets, but one of the things that can actually change your mind very well is surrounding yourself by people who lift you up and exhibit the characteristics or drive or work ethic that you want to have. Because motivation is contagious. There's been studies that show that, like, literally our fitness, if you are surrounded by, friends and family members who are also take fitness seriously, your chances of being obese drop dramatically, because, like, that motivation is contagious. So surrounding yourself wisely. And then the other thing that belonging or connection or support does is it literally changes how we see, the both our capabilities and the task demands that we face. So there's all sorts of research, and I outline in the book, that shows that, if we're staring down a really difficult challenge, if it is us ourselves, we will judge that challenge to be much harder. We'll say, oh man, that box of heavy objects is 200 pounds when really it's 150. Or that writing project is going to take 2 years when really it only takes, 1 year. When we're standing with someone literally, who is a friend, colleague, supporter, family member, we judge it more accurately. We feel like we can take on more. It switches our biology to have more of a challenge response instead of seeing the thing as a threat. So if you really want to perform to your potential, especially in a world that pushes us kind of to isolation and loneliness, like, find good people who support you, want the best for you, who challenge you, who exhibit the ideals and characteristics that you're trying to strive for as well. And if you do that, like, good things are going to happen.
Well, Steve, I think this is a perfect place for us to end our convo. Such a great chat discussion. And thank you so much for all that you shared. I think my audience can get a lot of value out of this.
Well, thanks so much, Doug. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope they check out the book Win the Inside Game. And thanks for having this convo.
Yeah, thanks again for featuring me in the book. Like, it meant a lot that you used my story in there. And again, thank you. And yeah, the audience should definitely go check out Win the Inside Game. It's a great book, great read, and it goes into more depth into what we talked about today. But thanks again for coming on the show, man.
Thanks so much.